albeit from a very great distance indeed. I'm here in the heartland of the United States. I'm in Montana, and so Greece is a long way away, but following closely what's been happening in your country under your leadership, and it's a great honor and privilege to have the chance to catch up with you. The last I saw one another was at the World Economic Forum at Davos back in January, and I remember we discussed the possibility of a pandemic at a time when almost nobody at Davos was discussing it. And I wanted to begin by asking you, what you subsequently did, because it's pretty clear from the data that Greece reacted more quickly and more effectively to COVID-19 than almost any other European country. I want to just ask you to describe the weeks after Davos and how you thought about the problem, when exactly you took action.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to chat. I would much prefer to be in Delphi and have this discussion in person, but I guess it's a new COVID reality and we still have to adjust to it. And thank you for your question, and I do indeed remember of the public discourse. It was not a topic that was discussed in great detail at Davos, but the warning lights were already flashing. And I guess as far as Greece was concerned, we had the benefit of seeing what was already happening in Italy. And at some point, we had a choice between waiting to collect more data and maybe have more clarity, or take a decision earlier. And we decided to take the basic decisions regarding lockdown earlier rather than later, and it proved to be, of course, you never know what would have happened had you reacted that way. But the evidence seems pretty clear. Countries that reacted quickly, aggressively, and with a very clear message managed to impose social distancing in practice and convince their population that this was the right approach to take. Eventually did better in containing the first phase of the epidemic. As you know, epidemic is also a Greek word. Epi means on, and demic refers to the demos, the people. We and I listened to their advice. I had again a choice between thinking about the economic fallout and the economic impact of what we were about to do, or protect human lives. Everyone who's living in Greeks, but also our refugee population, which by definition were more vulnerable. On top of that, I knew that we had a battered healthcare system, a relatively old population, so it was not that we were dealt a great opening at the beginning of this pandemic. And this may convince me that I needed to react sooner rather than later. And as far as the economic fallout is concerned, I think maybe the people who reasoned against lockdowns because they wanted to preserve economic activity, I think they got the causality wrong. I think it's those countries that did well in containing the epidemic, at least in its early stage, that will emerge stronger as we enter the recovery phase. So it was a very difficult period for us. It came right after we had to deal with another geopolitical crisis, and I'm referring to the effort by Turkey to push tens of thousands of migrants across our frontier in Greece, which we managed to deal with very effectively by sealing our border, protecting Greece's borders, but also Europe's borders. So I was forced to deal with two sort of very complicated crises in a short period of time. But right now, I can tell you that I'm quite happy with how how we reacted, very proud of the way the Greek people reacted, and very, very proud that we actually got people on board. We didn't coerce them into changing their behavior. We convinced them. And in a country that had its history, as you know, over the past decade of some civil unrest, it was important that all this happened extremely peacefully. Very little conspiracy theory, floating around. Everyone was convinced that this was the right thing to do. And one of the reasons why I think we succeeded was because we gave the experts the floor and we let them do the talking, and we depoliticized essentially what is a public health crisis.
Well, I'm sure your Greek audience is familiar with the data, but just for any non-Greek listeners or viewers, it's worth noting that with just over 3,000 cases, 183 deaths, and around 1,300 people regarded as recovered, Greece really has exceptional statistics from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it compares favorably per million data. I think Germany even today has 7 times higher a rate of cases in relation to the population. And when you look at the mortality relative to population, Greece is just early on, before it was really clear the correct response, as all the epidemiologists I respect have long argued, is early action. And those countries that decided on the opposite course, which includes the United States and the Kingdom, have paid an extremely heavy price in terms of excess mortality. Of course, you can't really talk about this pandemic as if it's over. Most pandemics historically last years, 2 years in the case of modern pandemics. So I wanted to now look forward and ask how you're thinking about reopening, returning life to normal, and what measures, what precautions you have in place with any new outbreaks.
First of all, we've started gradually reopening our economy, and we've done so over the past month. So far, it has been relatively, with one exception of a small, very regional outbreak in northeastern Greece, which I think we have managed to contain. We haven't seen any significant uptake in the number of new cases, and the number of people in our ICU beds, which in my mind is probably the most important indicator, because all countries have different testing strategies. What we need to look at is really mortality and the number of people that are actually hospitalized from COVID. It keeps going down. I think we have maybe 13 or 14 people across the country in total in ICU beds from COVID. So even during the most difficult weeks, we didn't even come close to reaching full capacity when it comes to our public healthcare system. And that was, again, the measure of our success. So what do? We gradually open up. Economic activity has gone back more or less to normal in Greece, but we still need to keep basic precautions. And social distancing rules are here to stay. You're right to point out the pandemic has not been defeated, and I won't get tired telling Greek people that we should not be the victims of our success. We shouldn't relax too much. We still need to be careful, wear masks wherever the experts tell us that we need to wear masks, in public transport or in places where we have to be, by definition, we are in close contact. Still take care of vulnerable people, and still make sure that we get the contact tracing right. We did an exceptionally good job in contact tracing in Greece, because we managed to keep the numbers low. You can do all that if you have small numbers. If the pandemic breaks out of the small circles that you can contain, then all this becomes extremely difficult and extremely complicated. But of course, for us, and I'm sure you want to ask about that in our discussion, big challenge is tourism. How do we open up, and how do we make the success story of dealing with the first wave of the pandemic a success story of opening up the country to tourists, but with rules, and with their protection and their health as our #1 priority, and with, of course, protecting the local population, in particular the staff that is actually working in the hospitality. I think we have a very well thought out plan. I will be in Santorini on Saturday to sort of launch what is going to be a different tourism season, but we still expect a fair number of travelers to travel to Greece, especially after July 1st, when we will be relaxing most of our measures.
So just to dig a bit deeper into that, how are you going to manage the reality that a great many people who come to Greece for holiday this summer will be coming from countries that did not have COVID-19 so successfully, and where infection rates are significantly higher? Will tourists be tested on arrival? Are you going to have some kind of quarantine in place? I certainly know that in some Asian countries, the measures are pretty strict for people coming in from abroad. It takes a very long time, for example, to get into Hong Kong. So what exactly will happen, and how should tourists considering a trip to Greece prepare themselves for their arrival?
Well, first of all, we're doing everything in phases. Right now, I need to point out that you can fly into Greece. There are a few countries where we've limited, where we don't allow flights, but everyone who flies into Athens, which is the only airport that right now accepts international flights, is everyone. Everyone has to stay one night in a hotel provided by the Greek state. After, once the tests come out, and overwhelmingly the tests are negative, we've had very, very few positive cases from people traveling into Greece. They're free to go and on the country. We're going to be moving into phase 2, which is essentially the 2 weeks between June 15th and June 30th, where we will allow flights into Athens and Thessaloniki from more countries. And essentially there, we are dividing the countries based on a list of airports that was provided by the European authorities into sort of high risk and lower risk countries. We'll be testing more people from higher risk countries. And then as we move into the main phase of opening up, as of July 1st, we expect to be fully in line with European directions, which means we want to open up travel to the European Union and the Schengen countries by July 1st. And there we will be doing targeted random testing, because of course it is very difficult to test everyone, using a very complicated but I think well-developed algorithm that takes in place epidemiological data from all countries. And of course, by then there still will be some countries where we will not allow visitors to come. I expect the UK to be on that list still by then. Talking to the United Kingdom, maybe we can establish at some July 15th safe corridors that will allow for some traveling from the UK to take place. But for the European Union, we will be open to welcome tourists as of July 1st. But of course, we will do it in a very outside. This is very important for us because we know that the transmission rates outside are a fraction of the transmission rates inside. So we want to push people to be quite easy to do in Greece. But of course, encouraging people to travel to Greece and put them in a quarantine while they travel to Greece defeats the purpose. So I think we need to strike a right balance. We have all the infrastructure in place to deal, God forbid, with any sort of small regional outbreak. We've ramped up our testing capacity. We have, infrastructure in our hospitals, in our islands, and there will be, some small islands which accepted a small number of charter flights. That wherever we accept tourists, we have the necessary infrastructure to do the random testing, but also the hospital or primary care infrastructure to deal with any unforeseen case. So we know we will have a fraction But still, we want to save whatever we can, but we want to do it safely. And we will monitor the data very carefully. And there's always a big, I want to be very honest about that. If there's any change, we're always free to change our approach. If things in a country turn out towards the worse, we will be, of course, we always reserve the right to change our approach, because the last thing we want is to endanger people who travel, but also to endanger, the Greek population, especially people who work in the hospitality sector. I should also add, and we didn't discuss it, that we have put in place a very and maybe we want to jump into that as the discussion continues. This is not just about the pandemic, it's also dealing with the economic fallout from the pandemic and what do we do on that front. And this is not just about tourism, it's about the overall economy. And I'm happy, if you have questions on that, to talk about the economic measures that we've taken.
That is exactly what I want to ask you next. The OECD just published some projections which were notably more pessimistic. The IMF's back in April. It looks as if in the second quarter the Greek economy contract by as much as 45%, which is a pretty stunning number. But it'll bounce back in the third quarter by as much as 33%. The big question the OECD is asking is what will happen if there are second waves, not just in Greece, but I think let's talk more generally about Europe and the world. And in the scenario of second waves, you could actually have a contraction again in the fourth quarter. Now, for Greece, had an economic battering over the past decade, as you know only too well. This is another very heavy hammer blow. And because of Greece's reliance on tourism and hospitality as a sector of the economy, it's hitting Greece pretty hard. So let's talk a little bit about that economic shock and what you're able to do to offset it. Unlike some countries, Greece doesn't have a great deal of policy room for maneuver. It can't do, for example, what the United States has done, which is a massive monetary and fiscal effort to offset the shock. So in some ways, you're the tightest economic spots of any country, because you can't, in fact, ramp up your deficit and you can't have an independent monetary policy. Tell us a little bit about dealing with the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression with almost no policy.
Today we have more policy levers than we had 6 months ago. And let me explain why. First of all, we managed to make sure that Greek bonds are included in the bond purchasing program of the ECB. That was not the case until very recently. Also, as you know, there are exceptions which also apply to Greece regarding fiscal rules for 2020, and I do expect that those exceptions are probably also going to be put in place for 2021. You remember we've had these discussions. Greece was forced to produce a very high primary surplus of 3.5%. This is no longer the case, so we will be running a deficit, as most countries will be, because we need to support the real economy. So, we've also been able to regularly tap the international capital markets and to replenish our cash buffer. And we've actually done so at very reasonable terms. We issued a 10-year bond a few days ago, heavily oversubscribed, with a coupon of 1.5%, a yield of 1.55%, very prices. So the markets, I think, trust this government, and I think they understand that under these conditions there needs to be a lot of government spending to support the real economy, and in particular to support jobs. And we've done so. We've put in place, a huge, by Greek standards, or I would say a very big, huge is probably, but certainly a very big stimulus program, 14 billion in fiscal measures and 10 billion in guarantees. And our main goal has been to support employment. And I think we reacted very quickly to support the real economy. Essentially, we've picked up a significant amount of the wage bill of private companies that were forced to close down during the crisis. We provided companies with state funding to companies on relatively favorable terms because we understand liquidity is a huge issue. We've pushed tax obligations into the future. So we're very concerned with liquidity of households, liquidity of companies. And if you look at the numbers, everyone was predicting, a Greek disaster. If you look at least the numbers from the first quarter, they've been, in the midst of what is a crisis, relatively encouraging. Only 0.9% recession, when the Eurozone average is 3.6%. What does this tell me? That the Greek economy entered the crisis with a lot of momentum, which we know was actually the case because we were doing rather well before the crisis hit us. So there was momentum, and of course, March was not as disastrous as many people thought it would be. Of course, the second quarter is going to be very, very difficult. We don't exact numbers yet, but we intervened very quickly to make the shock as flexible working arrangements. This is very important, especially for tourism. Similar schemes exist in many countries. Germany has been the leader in this. Employer to employ someone only, let's say, for 15 days out of 30. We pay them almost their full wage. We also cover their social security contributions. It gives companies, especially hotels, the flexibility to open with more staff, use them for less amount of time because they don't have as much work to do, but while at the same time protecting jobs, which should be our number one priority. So we intend to put in place what we call this bridge program until September, October, when we will have more visibility in terms of what. So we are spending a lot of money to support the real economy, but we are aware of the fact that we have a big legacy, we have a big public debt, and unlike what the oppositioning is encouraging us, which is to spend like there is no tomorrow, we want to leave some ammunition available because we don't know when this crisis is going to end. And of course, although and I'm sure we'll discuss this as the discussion goes on, the European proposal has been very ambitious and very bold. It hasn't been finalized yet, so we cannot spend money that we don't yet have. We first need to finalize the European proposal, have it signed and sealed and approved by the Council, and then we will know exactly how much room we have to maneuver and how much additional fiscal space we can use to support the economy during this very difficult period.
I wonder if, in common with some people here in the United States, you're asking yourself, is my future, perhaps not in 2021, but maybe in 2022, going to be another debt crisis, given the enormous amounts of government borrowing that are going on? Right now, we're all focused on the public health emergency and the need to keep the economy from imploding, but it does imply an even higher Greek debt tomorrow, as you say. So how do you think about that? Or is it something you just don't think about right now because your focus is entirely on the problems of 2020?
I think we will be moving towards a world where we will need to accept the fact that there will be more debt. The question is on whose balance sheet. And that is why the discussion within the European Union is so important. And that is why we've made the argument which the Commission, but also the big countries, France, Germany, accepted in principle, is that you need to support the economies that were hit and that are also have a legacy of debt through grants and not through additional loans. And this is the direction of the Commission, which I think is absolutely right. The Commission has put forward a very ambitious proposal. It has put its money where its mouth is. It includes a significant amount of grants to support countries that have been hit, and a mechanism for the Commission itself to issue debt at the European level. So the question is, where is the debt actually going to be issued? Now, as a percentage of GDP, but with relatively debt repayment obligations until 2032. And of course, as long as interest rates stay low, and I supporting the system and the banking system with additional liquidity, I don't think this is sort of a question that needs to be addressed urgently. But in order for this to happen, we need to make sure as a European Union that we go down the path that the Commission has proposed, which means the ability to issue debt at the Commission level and to support member states primarily through grants and not through loans, provided, of course, that these grants will be used in a wise manner, be spent necessarily on handouts and on subsidies, but they will be used to actually make our economies more resilient and more competitive. And this is what we intend to do. The initial allocation by the Commission provisions, an additional fiscal support on top of what we will be getting as a result of the multi-annual financial framework, that is around 32 billion. I don't know if that is going to be a final number, but it's certainly a very, very big number, which forces us to think creatively how we will use this money, how we will invest it into transforming the economy. This money is going to be used to feed into our main agenda of green transformation, of digital transformation, of making sure that our workforce has the right skills to adapt to the digital economy. So we want to use this additional funding to make sure that we drive through an ambitious reform program. And of course, at the same time, stay faithful to our main plan, which is a plan of gradually reducing taxes and social security contributions to make our economy more competitive. So this is a big opportunity for Greece, but we need to make sure that we convince some European countries that this is the right approach, not just for Greece or for Italy, for Spain, but for Europe as a whole. Because now if we don't move down that direction, then the threat to the single market is going to be profound. And it's those countries, smaller, more advanced, primarily benefit from the single market. And in a globalized economy, we're all dependent on each other. So I think this proposal, it's imperative that it's approved by the Council, more or less as it is. And that will send a very clear signal that the European Union as a whole is taking control of a very difficult situation and is using also its fiscal power, not just the monetary power of the ECB, to address what is, as you pointed out, an unprecedented crisis, something we've never seen before in our lifetimes, and hopefully we'll never see again.
I want to talk about the European politics a little bit, because while it can seem as if the European Commission's work is rather bureaucratic, in truth there's been considerable drama within the European Union. Phrase sauve qui peut, every country for itself. And certainly in neighbouring Italy, there was a good deal of ill feeling when it seemed that Germany and other countries were prioritising their own health needs over their neighbours' needs. Now, that didn't arise in the case of Greece for reasons we've discussed, but you've obviously had a ringside seat, a seat actually on stage as these political dramas have unfolded. And maybe I can ask to tell me if I'm right when I say that there was a huge shift in attitudes, particularly in Germany, that led from this initial crisis period to the very bold proposal that the Commission now has come up with, which I think most of us regard as the Macron-Merkel plan, and which looks very likely to be passed because the frugal four are, I think, down to a frugal two at this point. So I guess I'm interested to know if I'm right in thinking that something big changed in Germany, because certainly from a Greek vantage point, this is a very different Angela Merkel from the Angela Merkel of the global financial crisis. And it's certainly literally it's a different German finance minister, because Wolfgang Schäuble's no longer in that position, Olaf Scholz is. You've been involved in these discussions, and obviously you can't breach confidence, but I think you can help us understand what exactly changed in Berlin and why.
My chief economic advisor reminded me that 10 years ago, exactly to the date, Newsweek, which was still published in print edition, at the time, had a photo with someone throwing a firebomb in Athens with the title was "The End of the Euro." The euro didn't end, thank God. And this crisis is very different from the crisis of 2010. And there's no moral element in this crisis. There are no good guys or no bad guys. There's no one who sort of benefited from the benevolence of others to take advantage of what they're doing here. It's a symmetric shock that affects everyone. And that, I think, to a certain extent, affected Germany's thinking, because everyone realized that they're not immune to this crisis. And the preservation of the single market, especially for countries which are very much export dependent, is of paramount importance. And I have great respect for Angela Merkel, and I think she, in accepting and coming up with this French-German proposal, which is, at the of also what the Commission has proposed, I think she is taking Germany in the right direction. But the discourse today is very different from the discourse 10 years ago. And I think we all realize what I told you before. It is in our self-interest as a properly functioning internal market to preserve the internal market, strengthen it, and making sure that there are no weak links. Because if there are weak links, we all remember what can happen, because it has happened once. And we stirred into the abyss. We stirred in 2015. To a great extent, that was the fault of the previous government that pushed us to that point until it made, a spectacular U-turn. But it still cost us, 3 years in terms of lost growth. But the narrative today is also very, very different. But there's also an argument to be made about us, especially. I have to speak only from a Greek perspective. I can't speak for the other southern neighbors. That we still need us money in the form of grants, that these grants will be used wisely, that this is an opportunity to actually transform the economy. Greece has been a recipient of EU grants for the past 40 years. We have not always, I'll be very honest with you, we have not always used this money in the best possible. And we need to change that. That's why, once the plan is approved, we will place a lot of emphasis on the proper governance of how we're actually going to use this money, make sure that it's done in full transparency with accountability, but also with taking into consideration the long-term perspective of how we actually transform the competitiveness and strengthen the competitiveness of the economy. So I think when we discuss at the Council, a lot of it also has to do with personal credibility. Greece is strengthened, is coming stronger out of this crisis. It was a surprise story. No one was expecting Greece to do that well. I think the brand of the country has been strengthened. A lot of reforms were pushed through the crisis. It is surprising how quickly the digital transformation of the state actually took place. How many more services are offered online? We did in weeks things that hadn't happened for years. And people suddenly realize, whoa, we don't necessarily have to visit the Greek public administration. We can do things online, which are maybe obvious. Crisis as a catalyst for change, but also the crisis as an opportunity to rebuild trust in our institutions, in our democracy, in our political system, is extremely important. Greeks trust the state again. I remember that in my political lifetime. There was always a lot of distrust as to what the state can do. And there's also a case to be made, which is interesting because I come from a liberal background, but I fully recognize that there are times when countries need to have their Keynesian moment. and they need to spend, and the state needs to be present. And when the state needs to be present, it needs to be present forcefully and effectively, which is, I think, what we have to a certain extent done so far. And we've also had the benefit of being, a medium-sized, relatively centralized country. We didn't have any real problems with our regions, so we managed to actually, in a crisis, running a tight ship through a strong center of government is actually a big plus. So coming back to your original question, I think the narrative is changing in Germany, and I do give this, and I think there's a better understanding of the global dynamic and for the need of the European Union to do something big. I don't know if it's a Hamiltonian moment or whatever we want to call it, but it is something big. We shouldn't underestimate what has been done and what has been put forward. It is an ambitious, very ambitious proposal, and I hope it will be ratified sooner or later. I would hope sooner by the Council.
Asking if Britain's departure from the European negotiations has made it easier to have this Hamiltonian moment. This is a sort of footnote in a way, because Brexit is no longer the consuming preoccupation of European politics. But it occurs to me that if Britain was still in the room, it probably wouldn't be helping in the direction of fiscal integration. That Hamiltonian moment, that's an allusion, in case anyone is wondering, to Alexander Hamilton, the first American Treasury Secretary, who created a sort of mutualization of the debts of the founding American states. I'm not sure if Europe is quite there, but I'm pretty sure that if Britain was still in the European Union, it would be about the least enthusiastic member with respect to that kind of fiscal integration. Do you miss Britain?
Well, I was always a fervent supporter of the idea that Britain belongs within the European Union. I wasn't, I'm relatively new to the Council, so I hadn't the chance to interact with, British prime ministers at the level of the Council. Only had one interaction with Boris Johnson at the level of the Council. So it is a hypothetical question. I don't know, how the United Kingdom would have reacted in these negotiations. I know that in previous budget negotiations, if you look back to 2014, it was difficult to agree a budget, but it is a hypothetical question. I think what we need to do is to agree, phase 2 of Brexit. I don't know if we can keep our timetables. I'm concerned, given the fact that a lot of our focus now is on COVID. But again, it's up to the British government to decide whether they want to ask for any sort of extension to the negotiation. I'd go with the second best option, which is an honest relationship with the United Kingdom that is going to be fair to all parties involved. And there's no doubt that the European Union will continue to negotiate with the United Kingdom as one. And that's something we have succeeded in doing, and we will continue to do so.
Can I use the remaining of our time? You've already alluded to the political or geopolitical crisis that already confronted you over Turkey's treatment of refugees. Yeah, and I wanted to come back to that in just a moment. But if I take a step back and look at the world in mid-2020, I'm very struck by the fact that what I called Cold War II last year between the United States and China has only intensified during the pandemic on a whole range of issues. And it doesn't feel like a world in which international order is functioning terribly well. The World Health Organization doesn't seem to have covered itself in glory, to the point that President Trump intends to withdraw. Henry Kissinger, whose biography I am in the midst of writing, wrote an interesting op-ed a few weeks ago arguing that it was a fundamental crisis of world order that we confronted. From the vantage point of the Greek Prime Minister, does it feel like a a world disorder? And what does that imply for Greece? Because Greece has to think about more than just the other European Union member states. It has to think about a pretty unstable neighborhood to the east and to the south.
First of all, I agree with your assessment. The world order as it was sort of put in place after World War II, and I think served overall the world alliance is certainly under pressure. I think this intensifies the European Union much more relevant, and that is why I focus so much on making sure that we speak as one when it comes to the European Union, both on the economic front, but also on the geopolitical front. And that is why it's important to speak with one voice when it comes to the big geopolitical questions regarding our neighborhood. Extremely provocative in its activities over the past months, especially when it comes to signing what we consider to be a null and void agreement with Libya regarding the delimitation of maritime zones. You just have to take a look at the map to understand why this agreement doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We, on the other hand, as Greece, signed an agreement with Italy regarding the delimitation of our maritime zones with full respect to international. That is the way we solve our problems in our neighborhood, and hopefully we can convince everyone that this is the way to behave, and not through unilateral aggressive moves. But when it comes to our relationship with Turkey, it is not just a Greek-Turkish problem, it's an EU-Turkey problem. Greece is a member of the European Union. Our security concerns are also the security of the Union. When we're guarding our borders and when we're protecting our borders, we are protecting the borders of the European Union. I should remind you that when the crisis struck in the beginning of March, when we had this attempt of refugees, migrants under the guidance of Turkey, with the encouragement of the Turkish government to cross into Greece, and we succeeded in protecting our borders. 2 days later, the leadership of the European Union showed up at our northeastern borders as an indication of solidarity. So this is not just about Greek-Turkish differences. It's about the whole context of the relationship between the European Union and Turkey. And if Turkey is thinking about violating sovereign rights of the Hellenic Republic, not only will it get a response from Greece, I am pretty sure it will also get a response from Europe. This is not the path which I would like to take, but everyone needs to be aware that there will be severe consequences should that happen. Now, on the other hand, we're always open to talk with Turkey on the main issue which we have on the table, which is a question of the delimitation of our finally agree to disagree. There are always ways of taking this issue to international court in The Hague under a common agreement of how we can resolve this issue, but always with full respect to international law. This is not a time for gunboat deployment. This sort of logic belongs to a different century, and that's not the way to solve problems in our neighborhood and to have good neighborly relations, which I fundamentally believe Greece and Turkey should have. I mean, we're destined by geography to live together. We have common interests. I mean, the relationship shouldn't be as tense as it is now, but it is not. I'm absolutely convinced that it's not our fault.
You haven't mentioned NATO other than obliquely when you mentioned the transatlantic alliance, and yet it complicates life that Greece and Turkey are also members of NATO. It seems a while ago now, but it isn't that long ago that President Macron described NATO in rather inflammatory terms as brain dead. Is that how NATO strikes you, or does it still have a meaningful role to play in international order?
I wouldn't share that assessment. I think it was certainly If it was a wake-up call, it certainly served its purpose, but I wouldn't agree with that assessment. I think NATO. And we have problems with each other. And that is an issue for us as being, part of the alliance. And I've also made it very clear to the NATO leadership that, distancing itself from the problem is not always the best approach when you have a country that is clearly behaving. There is some soul searching that needs to take place within NATO regarding the future of the alliance, but the operational capabilities and the historical weight of NATO and everything it has achieved cannot be discarded that easily.
Well, we're rapidly running out of time, and I don't want to overrun, as I'm sure you have a packed schedule as always. I must say I struggle to imagine how one does the job of Prime Minister in the midst of a pandemic. It must be tremendously difficult, actually, that you normally do in the same space and same. Surprising that Greece has handled the pandemic as well as it has. After all, I was reading Thucydides just the other day on this subject. Greece has been grappling with the problems of plague since the days of Pericles, the heyday of Athenian democracy. So you have some experience with this, maybe a bit more than we in the United States, to put it mildly. Let me just conclude this with a final personal question. How is the pandemic affecting you as an individual, as a family? Some people find it extremely exhausting. There's been a huge explosion of frustration in the United States, which I think has as much to do with being cooped up for 2 months as it has with any of the questions that people have taken the streets to protest about. How has COVID-19 affected your life in this high-pressure position, which normally would involve you in meeting dozens and dozens of people every day? How's it affected you? How's it affected your family? Let's wrap on a personal note.
Well, thank you for making the reference to Thucydides. I like to, when I read the story, like to forget that actually Pericles died as a result of the plague. So we leave that.
I wasn't going to bring that up.
We'll leave that dimension of the story. But when it comes to, it's been a struggle. Of course, we work virtually, but at the end of the day, we have to work. And we have to at least have minimum interaction with my team, with my ministers during the pandemic. I found myself that the fact that we did a lot of work virtually organized my time slightly better. Meetings were on time, and they never ran beyond the scheduled time. So I think there's some value in doing some of the work remotely. But certainly there's a lot of pressure, and it certainly made me, reevaluate also my personal priorities to a certain extent. And I think the big lesson I learned is how do you take quick decisions under extreme pressure and with limited information. So you get as much information as you can, but you're never going to be fully sure. If you wait to be fully sure, you won't take any decisions. And at some point, you have to the data and your instinct, and to do what you think is right. On a personal level, I can tell you it was actually a reinvigorating experience in the sense that my kids came back from abroad, 2 of them at least. So we spent 3 months all together, had dinner every night, or whenever I was able to make it for dinner. And we actually got closer as a family. So in that sense, It was good, and family was big support. As you can only interact with your family, you couldn't even interact with your friends. That was very, very important. But I think also in terms of the collective mood, I think success, optimism, and vice versa. People felt proud again that we managed to do something which a lot of people thought was important, remarkable, or at least successful. And that made people feel better. So if you look at surveys now, even people understand that we're faced with a huge economic crisis, but there's still a degree of optimism, which I think comes out of the fact that we defied expectations and we felt proud again. As you know, pride is important, very important in collective identity. And of course, even during the very difficult days, there's a stress. There's waking up every morning, at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, you get the data regarding the infections. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, you get the data regarding what's happening on the migration front. So this is a constant, cycle of things happening, and you have to deal with a lot of unforeseen events. But Anglo-Saxons say, if you can't take the heat, you shouldn't be in the kitchen.
Well, you gave me a subtle hint there about keeping this meeting on time, and so I'm going to take the cue and simply thank you, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, Prime Minister of the Hellenic Republic, for this virtual fireside chat, and also take the opportunity to wish you and your country the very best of luck in this very challenging plague year of 2020. I look forward with hope that we'll be able to do this in a real space, real time way at Delphi in 2021.
Thank you.
Once again.
Keep safe, and hope to see you soon in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you.